All right, so you want to know the real story behind that crazy iPhone 4 prototype leak, right? Back in 2010, before social media was, well, everything, and Apple, they were super secretive, especially about new iPhones. A new iPhone back then, huge deal. Everyone remembers the basics.
Yep.
iPhone left at bar, ends up on Gizmodo. But there's so much more to it. It gets kind of dark, actually. We're going to dig into the human cost, the ethics of it all, and just how powerful Apple was.
Yeah, it's like a snapshot of a moment in time.
Yeah.
2010, Apple's at the top of their game.
Yeah.
And this iPhone 4, it was going to be a massive leap forward. FaceTime, like video calls on your phone.
Yeah.
The Retina display, everything was so sharp. It was their worst nightmare to have this thing leak.
Oh, totally. FaceTime, that was mind-blowing. To actually see the person you're talking to on a phone, like that was straight out of sci-fi. And the Retina display, you couldn't believe how good it looked. So yeah, having this prototype out in the wild, total disaster for Apple. Like you said, let's start with the part everyone knows. Gray Powell, he was 27, an Apple engineer, celebrating his birthday.
At a bar, yeah, a German bar called Gourmet House Stout, to be exact. And like a lot of Apple engineers back then, he was outfield testing the prototype, see how it worked in the real world. And Gray, he was working on a pretty critical part of the iPhone, the baseband software. Basically, how you make calls, the heart of the phone's communication.
So not just some random engineer then, they trusted him with some seriously top secret tech.
Oh yeah, big time.
And it was all hidden in this bulky case. I remember seeing pictures of it. They were trying to make it look like a regular old iPhone 3GS, going all out to keep it under wraps.
Totally. But even with all that secrecy, things went wrong. Gray leaves the bar, and that prototype, disguised or not, it's just sitting there on a bar stool.
And that's where Brian Hogan comes in. 21 years old, a student, and he finds this, tech treasure.
Yeah.
Now, at first he didn't know it was the next iPhone, thought it was a regular 3GS, but then he tries the camera and it keeps crashing. Something's up.
Definitely not right.
And then he sees it, the front-facing camera. Never been on an iPhone before, like finding a golden ticket. He actually tries to contact Apple, but they don't believe him. Can you imagine trying to explain that you found their super secret prototype?
I bet that was a fun conversation.
What a nightmare. So after getting brushed off by Apple, Hogan starts thinking, what do I do with this thing? Reaches out to some media outlets, and Gizmodo, they were a big tech blog back then, they take the bait, pay Hogan $5,000 for the prototype. Was that ethical, though? Should they have paid for something that was probably stolen?
That's where the debate starts. Some people were really critical of Gizmodo, said they were, throwing away journalistic integrity by paying for it. Others said it was a legitimate way to get a huge scoop. Got to remember, this was a different time for tech journalism. It was like the Wild West out there, everyone trying to break the next big story.
True, the lines were blurry back then. And then there's John Gruber. He had that influential Apple blog, Daring Fireball. At first, he believed Gizmodo, which gave them a lot of credibility. Later, he did criticize them, but that initial boost, that meant a lot.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And things escalate really quickly from there. Jason Chen, an editor at Gizmodo, he publishes a full teardown of the prototype, like 2 months before Apple's supposed to announce it. And the article blew up. It had every detail about the phone.
The Retina display, the front-facing camera, the design, it was all out there 2 months early. Apple must have flipped out. This wasn't just a leak. It was like a bomb going on.
Yeah, it was huge. And that's when Steve Jobs gets involved.
Yeah.
And he was not happy. He calls Brian Lamb, Gizmodo's editor-in-chief, personally demanding the phone back.
Ooh, now things are getting interesting. Let's dig into that in the next part of our deep dive. Okay, so we left off with Steve Jobs, Mr. Apple himself, and he is furious about this leaked prototype. What happened next?
Well, this whole thing blew up. Became front page news. We're not just talking tech blogs anymore. This was like mainstream media. Everyone's talking about this iPhone leak.
It was like everyone was suddenly obsessed with this iPhone. Late night talk shows were making jokes about it. The news was all over it. It was 2010. You got to remember, this is when smartphones were just starting to really take off. And Apple, they were leading the way.
Exactly. And this leak, it just made the hype even crazier. But behind the scenes, things were heating up, legally speaking. Apple, through this special task force called REACT, they get involved.
REACT, that sounds serious. What is REACT exactly?
It stands for Regional Enforcement Allied Computer Team. Basically, it was a law enforcement group in California, a bunch of different jurisdictions, and they focused on high-tech crime, intellectual property theft, cybercrime, that kind of stuff.
So, like the digital detectives of their time. Okay, so they're the tech specialists. But how does Apple fit into all of this?
Well, this is where it gets a little Interesting. Apple was on RACT's board of directors.
Wait, really?
Yep. Apple executives were part of this group that's now investigating the iPhone leak.
Hold on, that sounds like a conflict of interest, doesn't it? Apple's both the victim of the crime and, like, part of the team investigating it.
That's exactly what people were saying. Apple said, no, they just reported the theft like any company would.
Yeah.
But them being on RACT's board, it made people wonder if they were using their influence to, like, put pressure on Gizmodo.
Adds another layer to this whole thing for sure. So RECT gets involved, then what?
Things escalate big time. They raided Jason Chen's home, the Gizmodo editor who published that teardown. Can you imagine coming home and your house is full of police?
I can't even imagine. It must have been so stressful.
Oh, it was. Chen said it was a nightmare. They literally broke down his door and took computers, cameras, storage devices, anything that could have data on it.
Sounds like something out of a movie. Did they at least, I don't know, just stick to stuff related to the iPhone?
That's the thing, they didn't. They took stuff that had nothing to do with the iPhone, journalistic material from other stories Chen was working on, and that's when people started to get really concerned about freedom of the press. It felt like Apple was going too far.
Big time overreach. So while all this is going on with Gizmodo, what about Brian Hogan, the guy who actually found the phone?
Well, he and his roommates, they were also feeling the heat. The police were questioning them. Their lives were totally turned upside down. One of his roommates, Catherine Martinson, she started working with the police, hoping to get a reward for information.
Wow, talk about betrayal. So she flipped?
Pretty much. She was afraid of getting in trouble, especially since the sale of the phone was linked to her computer. But her cooperating, that put Hogan in a really tough position.
Yeah, the pressure must have been immense. Facing legal action from Apple, a company known for being, well, not very forgiving. But here's where things get even darker. While all this drama with Gizmodo is going on, there's this much more tragic story happening over in China. A guy named Sun Dan-young, he's like the forgotten victim in this whole iPhone 4 saga.
Yeah.
So who was he? How does he fit into this iPhone leak?
Sun, he worked at Foxconn, the factory in Shenzhen where iPhones were actually assembled. And his job was to send prototype iPhones back to Apple for testing. Now get this, months before the Gray Powell bar incident, Sun realized that an iPhone 4 prototype, it was missing.
Wait, so two missing iPhone 4 prototypes, one lost in a bar and another gone from a factory in China.
That's right. And Sun's story, it's just this awful example of the pressure these workers were under. After he reported the missing prototype, Foxconn security, they really came down on him. Interrogations, there were even reports that they used intimidation tactics.
Easy to forget that behind all the cool gadgets, there are real people working, often in some really tough conditions. And when something goes wrong, like a missing prototype, man, the consequences can be huge.
Yeah, for Sun, it wasn't just a lost phone. It was a potential leak that could mess up Apple's entire launch. Imagine that pressure.
So what happened to Sun Dan-young?
This is the sad part. In July 2010, just a couple months after that prototype disappeared, he jumped from his apartment building, 12th floor, and he died. And we know from text messages he sent, he felt totally trapped, worried about his family, his future, everything.
That's just heartbreaking. It really puts things in perspective. It's a reminder of the human cost behind all this tech stuff. Did Apple respond to his death like the same way they responded to the Gizmodo leak?
That's what's so striking about this whole thing. At first, Apple's response to Sun's death was very low-key. They put out a short statement saying they were sad, but that was pretty much it. But then, as more suicides happened at Foxconn, there were a bunch around that time, the pressure on Apple just kept growing.
I guess they couldn't ignore it anymore. People were starting to pay attention, and it was hurting Apple's image. What did they end up doing?
They launched an independent investigation into the suicides at Foxconn, looking into the working conditions there, the mental health support, all of that. And they did make some changes at Foxconn, like hiring more counselors, setting up a 24-hour care center, and the most visible thing, they put up nets outside the buildings to try and stop people from jumping.
Those nets, man, they became like this symbol of what was happening at Foxconn, how much pressure these workers were under. Makes you wonder, though, was it enough? Or was it too little, too late?
That's a question a lot of people still ask. But Sun Dan-young's story, it's a powerful reminder. Behind the gadgets, the hype, there are real people. And their lives are impacted by these big tech companies, sometimes in really tragic ways.
So we've got two leaks, two very different responses from Apple, and two individuals whose lives were forever changed by this whole thing. What happens next? So we've been talking about these two separate iPhone 4 prototype leaks, one in a California bar, the other in a factory in China. And Apple's reactions, man, they were totally different. What can we take away from all this?
Well, when you zoom out and look at the whole picture, it really brings up some big questions about ethics, power, especially in tech, like the Gizmodo leak that started this whole debate about how journalists should operate.
Hmm.
Was it okay for Gizmodo to pay for a stolen prototype? I mean, was that even legal?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, on the one hand, they got a huge story, exposed how secretive Apple was. But on the other hand, they're dealing with stolen goods. Was it worth it?
Hard to say, honestly. They definitely pushed the limits of traditional journalism,
Yeah.
especially with tech blogging being so new back then.
Hmm.
And then you've got Sundan Young's death, just a tragedy. And it really highlights the dark side of these global supply chains.
It makes you think, you know? Behind every iPhone, every gadget we use, there are real people making them, working in conditions we probably don't even want to imagine.
Exactly. And it makes you question, like, what's Apple's responsibility here? What do they owe to these workers? How do they balance wanting to be secretive with, you know, treating their employees fairly?
Yeah, it's something to think about.
Yeah,
And these are questions that haven't gone away. I mean, supply chains are even more complicated now, and people want to know where their stuff comes from. They want companies to be ethical.
for sure. This whole story also gets into the idea of power, the kind of power these big tech companies have, like Apple. It goes way beyond just tech into law enforcement, media, global manufacturing, everything.
Remember how Apple was on RAACT's board, the task force that raided Gizmodo's editor? Talk about influence.
Right. It really makes you think about accountability. Is there enough oversight to keep these companies in check, to make sure they're not abusing their power?
Kind of scary when you think about it, especially with how much we depend on these companies and their products every day. So in a way, the iPhone 4 leak, it wasn't just about a phone, it was about power, ethics, and the human cost of, well, progress.
And speaking of progress, it's interesting to see how this reflects how journalism was changing. Back in 2010, blogs were still pretty new, and the lines between bloggers and, like, real journalists, they were super blurry. Gizmodo, they were really testing those limits, paying for scoops, breaking news faster than anyone else.
They were in a whole different world, like the wild west of tech news. And Steve Jobs, he didn't like bloggers at all, thought they were way less credible than real journalists. But you could say what Gizmodo did, it kind of foreshadowed the rise of citizen journalism, how regular people can have a huge voice now thanks to technology.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Now, Apple, they can't ignore bloggers, YouTubers, social media influencers, none of them. They have so much influence on how people think. Total shift from back when Jobs tried to control everything.
So what does all of this mean for, like, the rest of us? We're the ones buying these gadgets caught in the middle of all this. What have we learned from all this, from this whole deep dive?
I think it shows how important it is to be, critical thinkers. We can't just get excited about shiny new gadgets without stopping to think about how they're made, who's making them, what kind of impact they have.
We got to be more aware as consumers, as citizens, especially now with technology being such a huge part of our lives.
And it's important to remember, too, behind all these amazing technological advancements, there are human stories.
Mm-hmm.
Some are good, some are tragic. We can't forget about those stories.
This deep dive, it's taken us way beyond just a lost iPhone. We've talked about the crazy stakes, the secrecy, the race to get the next big thing. But it makes you think, What does it say about us, about how we interact with technology when we so easily forget about the human cost? Something to consider.
Absolutely. We've given you the information, the different sides of the story. Now it's up to you to figure out what it all means.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll be back soon with more stories from the world of tech, so make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.